It's late. The world has quieted down, and perhaps you're lying awake, your mind drifting through restless thoughts. If so, you've come to the right place. Let your breath slow, your body sink deeper into stillness, and allow this story to carry you far away, to another time. A time when gods walked the earth. Over 3,000 years ago, on the banks of the Nile, in the heart of ancient Thebes, a girl was born who would one day be remembered not just as a queen, but as an icon of beauty, wisdom, and divine power. Her name was Nefertari. She lived in an age of grandeur, when Egypt stood as a beacon of civilization, its temples gleaming in the desert sun, its language etched in sacred stone. The air was thick with incense, the hymns of priests echoed through colonnades, and every grain of sand seemed to shimmer with the presence of gods. But little is known about the girl who would one day become the great royal wife of Ramses II. Her family origins are cloaked in mystery. Some scholars suggest she may have belonged to a noble Theban line, perhaps connected to the priesthood. Others believe she might have been born into a family of scribes, educated elites who served the spiritual and political machinery of the kingdom. What we do know is that Nefertari was no ordinary woman. From a young age, she was surrounded by rituals, hieroglyphs, temple walls, and sacred traditions. She was not just taught how to be noble, she was shaped to embody the concept of Ma'at, the divine balance of order, truth, and justice. This spiritual foundation would define her entire life. In a world where most women were kept from education, Nefertari likely learned to read and write hieroglyphs. That alone made her rare. It gave her access to a level of understanding and political nuance few women of the time could claim. Imagine her, walking the polished floors of Karnak or Medinet Habu. A young girl in white linen, quiet but observant, watching how the gods were worshipped, how offerings were made, how the rituals were spoken, not just as rote, but as power. She would have seen statues of Isis and Ether, goddesses of wisdom and beauty, and perhaps wondered if she, too, could one day stand among them, not in myth, but in memory. And then, at some point in her early years, her path crossed with that of a prince. His name was Ramses. The son of Pharaoh Seti I, Ramses was being prepared for rule from an early age. He was ambitious, commanding, a born leader. And yet, he chose Nefertari, not simply as a wife, but as an equal. Their union was not one of political necessity, though it may have helped forge alliances. It was one of devotion. When Nefertari married Ramses, she was given the title Great Royal Wife. This was no ceremonial label, it meant she was first among the king's wives, his closest advisor, his spiritual counterpart. And Ramses made no effort to hide his love. He immortalized her in statues, inscriptions, and temple walls. He wrote poetry for her, declaring her beauty greater than all others, her voice like the sound of a harp, her grace like the rising sun. He called her she for whom the sun shines. In a time where men held dominion over state, religion, and legacy, Ramses chose to raise his queen into the light. He didn't diminish her. He exalted her. On the temple walls, Nefertari is shown standing beside Ramses, not behind him, but beside him, carved to the same height. A visual declaration that her importance was equal to his. In some depictions, she is offering gifts to the gods while Ramses stands aside. In others, she leads a procession or prays before the goddess Ether, whose identity she would symbolically mirror. This was a queen whose presence radiated across the empire. Her clothing was made of the finest linen, adorned with gold and lapis lazuli. She wore crowns styled with vulture wings, lotus flowers, or sun discs. Every image of her reflects not just luxury, but sanctity. Yet it wasn't just her beauty that made her exceptional. It was her mind. Nefertari played an active role in diplomacy, particularly during the tense political climate of the early 13th century BCE. She corresponded with royal families from foreign lands. Letters to the Hittites still survive, signed in her name. These letters weren't just ceremonial. They were carefully crafted pieces of statecraft, designed to maintain peace, manage alliances, and assert Egypt's prestige. Through her words, Nefertari helped hold together the fragile balance between power and harmony. She was more than a queen. She was Egypt's voice to the world. Even in the spiritual realm, her influence was profound. Nefertari took part in major festivals, rituals, and temple ceremonies. As God's wife of Amun, she acted as an intermediary between the gods and the people, a position of deep religious significance. In a civilization obsessed with eternity, it is telling that Ramses chose to honor her with more than mere affection. He carved her image into eternity. But that we'll return to later. For now, let us stay in this early chapter of her life. A chapter filled with rising light. With soft sandals on temple floors, the rustle of linen robes, the scent of blue lotus and myrrh. Let us imagine her in the palace gardens, perhaps listening to a scribe recite hymns, or watching her children play beneath the shade of sycamore trees. A moment of calm. A breath between storms. Because beyond the golden horizon of her youth, destiny was already waiting. The palace in Pyrameses was unlike any other in Egypt. It was not merely a seat of power, but a vision, an entire city forged in the image of a god-king. There, amid colonnades and lotus gardens, in rooms adorned with gold leaf and lapis blue, Nefertari walked as both queen and symbol. She wasn't just the wife of Ramses II. She was the embodiment of Egypt's grace, wisdom, and spiritual balance. Their love was not hidden in scrolls, not whispered behind veils. It was carved into temples. It echoed through the architecture of eternity. Ramses did what few pharaohs ever dared. He raised his queen to divine visibility. In his own words, he wrote of her, "My love is unique. No one can rival her. For she is the most beautiful woman alive. Just by passing, she has stolen my heart." These weren't the cold declarations of duty. These were lines of longing, desire, worship, and the world saw it. In the famed Abu Simbel complex, deep in the cliffs near the Nubian border, Ramses constructed two massive temples. One for himself, and one for Nefertari. The smaller temple, though it appears modest next to its counterpart, holds a significance unmatched in all of Egypt's architecture. For it is the only known temple in all Egyptian history dedicated by a pharaoh to his queen. There, 6 colossal statues greet the desert. 4 of Ramses, and 2 of Nefertari. She is not overshadowed. She is equal in height, posture, and presence. This wasn't just love, it was theology. Inside the temple, Nefertari is shown making offerings to Atha, goddess of joy, music, and motherhood. She is depicted not as a mortal supplicant, but as one divine being honoring another. This temple was a sanctuary, a shrine to their bond. The columns within are carved with her name. The walls echo with the language of devotion. Even the orientation of the temple, aligned so that sunlight reaches the inner sanctuary on specific dates, was designed to honor both her and the gods. Few monuments in the ancient world were as personal or as poetic. But Nefertari's legacy wasn't built on love alone. It was also carved by strategy, diplomacy, and the skillful performance of queenship. As great royal wife, she held a place not only beside the pharaoh, but beside the throne itself. Egypt's complex court system, steeped in tradition and power, offered few true equals to a king. Nefertari was one of them. She played a key role in religious festivals, including the Opit festival and the beautiful Feast of the Valley. These were not mere parades, they were cosmic rituals meant to renew the land and the king's divinity. In these processions, Nefertari often rode in ceremonial boats or walked beside sacred barks, representing not just womanhood, but the eternal feminine power through which the gods themselves were born. There are images of her participating in the Hepsed festival, a ritual traditionally focused on the king's rejuvenation and power. Her inclusion was rare, if not unprecedented. And perhaps the most profound sign of her status was this. On many monuments, Nefertari is not identified by her role as Ramses' wife. She is called Beloved of Mut, Mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt. She who gives life. titles normally reserved for goddesses. Her presence became so intertwined with sacred authority that in certain temples, her face replaces those of traditional deities. In some carvings, she offers blessings not as a follower, but as a figure of veneration herself. This was not vanity. It was symbolism. Nefertari was the image of Ma'at, the divine order, the feminine force through which chaos was tamed and kings were born. Even her name, Nefertari Meritmut, meant the most beautiful, beloved of Mut. And she lived that name fully. In diplomacy, too, she left her mark. A set of clay tablets found in Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, includes letters exchanged between Egyptian and Hittite royalty. Among them is a rare treasure, a letter written by Nefertari to the Hittite queen Puduhipa. The letter was gracious, eloquent, and strategic. It spoke of friendship between nations, of peace following conflict, and of shared divinity between queens. Nefertari sent gifts, fine linen, gold jewelry, ointments of lotus and myrrh. This was more than courtesy. It was soft power. It showed the queen not only as a figure of beauty and worship, but as a diplomat capable of maintaining peace across once hostile lands. Egypt and the Hittites had fought bitter wars. Yet now, two women, two queens, spoke the language of alliance. And through her words, Nefertari carried Egypt's grace into foreign palaces. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, Ramses continued to honor her. In nearly every major monument of his reign, her image appears, sometimes seated beside him, other times presiding over rituals or feasts. He never ceased proclaiming her importance. But time, even for the favored of the gods, was always moving. The sand flows in both directions, building legacy while slowly covering the feet of even the greatest queens. Nefertari's light was strong. But soon, that light would begin to flicker. And Egypt would prepare for one of the most sacred rituals it had ever known. The burial of a queen who had become more than mortal. In ancient Egypt, power was never merely political. It was sacred. To rule was not just to govern, it was to maintain balance between the worlds of gods and men. And no queen understood this better than Nefertari. Her role extended far beyond the golden halls of the palace. She was the visible thread between heaven and earth. The keeper of Ma'at, truth, justice, cosmic balance. Ma'at was not an abstract concept. It was life itself. The rise of the Nile, the turning of the seasons, the beating heart of Egypt depended on its preservation. Every pharaoh swore to uphold it. But few queens embodied it so fully as Nefertari. She was more than consort. She was ritualist, priestess, and symbol. In temple ceremonies, she took on sacred duties, pouring libations, burning incense, making offerings. Not as a servant, but as a vessel of divine energy. Her gestures, her words, her very presence were believed to stabilize the universe. She was closely tied to the goddess Atha, who ruled over love, fertility, and joy. But Nefertari's influence expanded further, to Mut, to Isis, even to Ma'at herself. In paintings, she is shown wearing the vulture crown, a headdress of queens and goddesses alike. Sometimes, she dons the solar disk with cow horns, symbols of celestial femininity. In others, she simply stands in white linen, hands raised in prayer, her posture serene and eternal. These images were not decorative. They were functional. To see the queen praying was to participate in her devotion. Her likeness became an instrument of divine continuity. She was not just of Egypt. She was Egypt. And in her final years, that truth became all the more profound. Nefertari likely began to fall ill sometime during the 24th or 25th year of Ramses's reign. The details are lost to time, but evidence suggests she did not live to see his 30th year on the throne. And yet, Ramses never stopped honoring her. As her health declined, preparations began for one of the most exquisite burial sites in the Valley of the Queens. A place carved into stone and silence. A tomb not meant merely to house her body, but to guide her soul. In Egyptian belief, death was not an end. It was a passage. The tomb was the vessel, the Book of the Dead was the map, and the queen was the traveler. Nefertari's tomb, designated QV66, is among the finest ever discovered in Egypt. Unlike many royal tombs that were lost, looted, or destroyed, hers survived with stunning clarity. Its walls are alive with color. Blues and reds, yellows and deep blacks. The figures are graceful, the hieroglyphs precise, the craftsmanship masterful. Every surface is a prayer. Every symbol a key. In scene after scene, Nefertari is shown making the perilous journey through the underworld. She passes through gates guarded by serpents, speaks sacred names to deities, and offers tribute to gods who control the fates of souls. We see her before Osiris, god of the dead, arms raised, head bowed. We see her heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at. We see her sailing on the solar bark toward the eternal fields. And we see her triumphant. One image shows her transformed, no longer mortal, but divine. Wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, carrying the ankh, standing among the gods not as a guest, but as one of them. The tomb is silent now, but its voice still lingers. And through it, Nefertari speaks across time. Her name, her beauty, her faith, preserved not by accident, but by devotion. Ramses made sure of that. He made sure the tomb was worthy not only of a queen, but of a soul destined to live forever. Even now, scholars and visitors walk through its chambers with reverence. The colors remain vivid, the atmosphere still sacred. And perhaps that was the point. To create a place where she would never truly die. In this sacred space, far from the noise of kings and conquest, Nefertari stands in quiet glory. Her eyes calm, her arms outstretched, her spirit in balance. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the prayers in the paint. There are no ancient records that mark the exact day Nefertari died. No announcement carved in stone. No royal decree of mourning. But somewhere in the final years of Ramses' youth, the queen who had stood by his side in power, in ritual, and in love, slipped beyond the veil. Her death must have shaken the palace to its foundation. And Ramses, the warrior, the builder, the god-king, was, in the end, a husband in grief. But he didn't respond with silence. He answered with stone. Nefertari's tomb, QV66, is nestled deep in the Valley of the Queens, far from the noisy corridors of the pharaohs. It is not the largest tomb. It is not filled with golden treasures like Tutankhamun's. But it is something more rare. It is a masterpiece. As you step inside, the walls greet you with life. Every color still breathes, ochre reds, sun-drenched yellows, deep cosmic blues. The ceiling above is painted like the heavens, a deep black sky dotted with golden stars. No corner is left untouched. Every inch tells a story. One moment, you see Nefertari walking toward the gods, holding sacred instruments. In another, she is being embraced by Isis, her hand resting gently on the goddess's shoulder. There is no fear in these images. Only peace. Beauty. Grace. This was not just a burial chamber, it was a vessel for resurrection. A divine theater where Nefertari would perform her journey through the underworld again and again, forever. The Book of the Dead inscriptions line the walls. Spells to guide her. Words to protect her. Symbols to unlock the gates of eternity. Her sarcophagus is long gone, likely looted centuries ago. Her mummy never recovered. But her presence remains. You feel it in the brushstrokes. In the quiet power of the figures. In the way light plays across the painted plaster, as if the gods still watch from behind the pigment. And beyond all of this, the architecture, the art, the ritual, there is one thing that endures most deeply. Ramses never replaced her. Yes, he had other wives. He fathered dozens of children. But no queen ever stood as Nefertari had. None were given her honors. None were immortalized beside him in stone. Even as he built his own legacy, colossal statues, sprawling temples, battle scenes carved on canyon walls, he kept her name alive. In the Abu Simbel temple, the smaller sanctuary still bears her form. not tucked into a corner, but carved into the front, equal in height to Ramses himself. In poetic inscriptions, he continued to call her the beloved, even long after her passing. In his court, her children were raised with privilege. Her memory was protected. And in the quiet moments, when Ramses walked through his temples or sat alone under the desert stars, he must have remembered the girl from Thebes, the one who walked beside him not just as a queen, but as a mirror of his soul. Few love stories from ancient history survive the way theirs has. It wasn't written in scrolls. It was written in stone. And through that stone, it has echoed for over 3,000 years. As you drift into stillness now, let yourself imagine this. The soft torchlight of a tomb chamber. The smell of resin and frankincense. A quiet chant rising in the background. And a queen, radiant in linen and gold, taking her first steps toward the field of reeds. A place of peace. A place beyond time. And somewhere, in that eternal field, the sun still rises for her. For the queen. For whom the sun shines. After Nefertari's death, the palace did not fall apart. The rituals continued. The ceremonies unfolded. The great machine of empire pressed forward, as it always had, as it always would. But something in Ramses changed. He remained a builder, a warrior, a divine ruler. His monuments grew larger, his campaigns more ambitious, his image more godlike. But in his eyes, in the stone-carved pupils of statues that watched over temples and plazas, there was a stillness that had not been there before. He lived on, longer than most pharaohs before or after him. 66 years on the throne. More than half a century after Nefertari's death. He married others. Nefret, among them, became the next great wife. His children grew, served, died. Entire generations passed beneath his sandals. But still, her name remained. Still, her temple stood. Still, her tomb whispered. Even as his hair turned white, and his voice grew softer, Ramses ensured that no one would forget her. His love did not fade, it fossilized. It calcified into the limestone walls of temples and the quiet prayers of scribes who copied her name century after century. There is no surviving record of Ramses speaking of Nefertari in his later years. But the absence of his queen is present in every monument where no other woman stands beside him. Even in the Ramesseum, his own mortuary temple, her image does not vanish. She appears in reliefs, elegant and composed, performing rituals as though she never left. It is almost as if she continued to walk through his memory, invisible yet ever present. In Egypt, death was never final. The dead lived in stories, in statues, in dreams. And in the case of Nefertari, she lived through love. But beyond Ramses, beyond the halls of power, what of the people? What did the common workers, the scribes, the dancers, the acolytes of Atha remember of their queen? Perhaps a gesture. A smile seen from a temple procession. A name spoken with reverence in markets and homes. A song once sung at a festival where she rode beside her king in shining robes. The memory of a queen was not only preserved by kings, but by the whispers of the people she touched. Her image became sacred. Her name evoked calm. Her story, softened by time, became a legend told by parents to children beneath the stars. Even the villagers near Abu Simbel, centuries later, would claim that the temple belonged to a goddess, not a queen, so graceful was her likeness. And then, time began to take its toll. The tomb was eventually sealed. Sand shifted over Abu Simbel. The names, the colors, the carvings, all slipped beneath the slow tide of forgetting. For over 3,000 years, Nefertari waited in silence. Until the modern world came knocking. For centuries, Nefertari was lost. Not in memory, but in matter. Her name survived in texts, her legend echoed in ancient hymns, but her tomb, her image, remained sealed beneath the sands of the Valley of the Queens. Time is merciless to stone. Winds erode. Earth shifts. Tombs collapse. Paint fades. Whole cities vanish beneath the weight of silence. And Nefertari, like so many of her peers, vanished into the deep folds of forgotten history. The Valley of the Queens, west of modern-day Luxor, was not always a place of pilgrimage. For long stretches of time, it was nothing more than a barren expanse of hills, its entrances buried, its secrets guarded by dust and rock. But in the early 20th century, a team of Italian archaeologists led by Ernesto Schiaparelli arrived in Egypt with hope, curiosity, and shovels. They had heard rumors of a royal tomb untouched by time, perhaps preserved by the dry desert air. They knew where to dig. And they dug with reverence. And then, in 1904, beneath layers of rubble and time, they found it. QV66. The tomb of Nefertari. It was not intact. The outer chamber had been breached by grave robbers centuries before. The treasures, gold, alabaster, perfumes, fabrics, were long gone. The sarcophagus had been broken. Her body, nowhere to be found. But the walls? The walls were waiting. When Schiaparelli lit his lantern and stepped into the tomb's main chamber, he saw something astonishing. Color. Brilliant reds and cobalt blues. Deep blacks. Warm yellows. The painted plaster glowed with life, untouched by air or sun for millennia. There was no need to imagine what the tomb once looked like, it was still there. And so was she. Nefertari. On the walls she stood tall, elegant, radiant. Wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. Holding the ankh of life. Embraced by Isis, greeted by Ra, judged by Osiris, welcomed by the stars. The walls told the entire story of her journey through the underworld, the 12-hour passage through fire and trial and judgment toward eternal rebirth. Scenes from the Book of the Dead covered every chamber. Hieroglyphs looped like vines across ceilings and thresholds. The ceiling of the burial chamber had been painted as a night sky, black as ink, studded with golden stars. It was not a tomb. It was a temple. A temple to a woman. A queen. A soul on its journey beyond time. Schiaparelli was stunned. His team worked slowly, carefully, documenting each inch. Drawings were made. Notes taken. And then, the tomb was sealed again. 4 decades, QV66 remained closed to the public. The walls, already delicate, had begun to flake upon exposure to modern air and breath. The Italian team had done their best to protect them, but preservation was still a primitive science. And then, in the late 20th century, a new effort emerged. In the 1980s and early 1990s, a team from the Getty Conservation Institute partnered with Egyptian authorities to restore the tomb. It was a delicate process, years of microbrushing, chemical analysis, pigment stabilization, and structural reinforcement. They worked not to recreate the past, but to freeze it, to stop its decay, to preserve its story. And finally, in the early 2000s, the tomb was opened again, this time for limited visitors. Only a few each day. Only for a few minutes at a time. But enough for the world to remember. Tourists who descended the narrow stone stairs into QV66 would step into a world unlike any other. No camera could truly capture the brilliance of those walls. No replica could imitate the intimacy, the serenity, the sacredness of that space. There, beneath meters of ancient earth, Nefertari lived again. But the rediscovery of her tomb did more than restore her memory. It reignited the study of royal women in Egypt. For decades, Egyptology had focused almost entirely on kings and warriors. Nefertari changed that. Her presence, so fully preserved, forced historians to look at the role of queens, priestesses, diplomats, and artists. She became the face of a new conversation. Documentaries were made. Exhibitions held. Scholars began to trace her influence beyond the reign of Ramses, into art, language, even fashion. Her elegance, her poise, her position, she became not just a historical figure, but a symbol of enduring feminine power. Fashion designers found inspiration in her silhouettes. Musicians invoked her name. Writers and poets sought to reimagine her life in novels, journals, essays. But no imagination ever exceeded what the ancients had already created. The real Nefertari, the one in pigment and plaster, in glyph and stone, remained the most complete portrait of love and power ancient Egypt ever left behind. And even in death, she continued to inspire, to awaken curiosity, to remind those who stood before her image that time, while relentless, cannot erase devotion. Immortality. For the ancients, it was not merely about living forever, it was about being remembered forever. To have your name spoken. To have your image preserved. To continue existing in the hearts and minds of those who came after. Nefertari achieved this. Not through conquest, nor through myth, but through grace. Her story is not one of wars and bloodshed. She was no ruler of armies, no wielder of the crook and flail. And yet, her legacy endures beside the greatest of kings. Why? Because she represented something deeper. In Nefertari, the Egyptians saw the perfection of Ma'at. Harmony. Balance. The way the world ought to be. Her beauty, her intellect, her ritual devotion, they were not superficial qualities. They were reflections of cosmic truth. She became a mirror. And in her, others saw what they hoped to become. The perfect wife. The loyal queen. The wise mother. The vessel of divine order. And even now, as we sit in a world unimaginably far from hers, we still feel that presence. Because to look at her tomb, to read her name, to speak her story, is to step outside of time. It is a reminder that even in the face of decay and forgetting, there are things that last. Love, memory, art, faith. And in her, all of them found a home. Historians continue to debate the full scope of her influence. Was she truly a diplomat? Did she help shape foreign policy? Were her letters authored by her hand, or merely signed in her name? But those questions, while important, miss the essence. Because Nefertari was not remembered for what she ruled, but for what she symbolized. The strength of stillness. The dignity of presence. The power of being seen. In every painted line along her tomb's walls, in every prayer etched in the Book of the Dead, in every poetic phrase Ramses left behind, we see a woman fully realized. Not a shadow of her husband. Not an extension of the pharaoh. But a sovereign of the soul. That is rare. Even among queens. Her immortality also lies in something more intimate, the love she received. The way Ramses wrote of her. The way he built for her, honored her, mourned her. We often remember the empires, the victories, the monuments. But we forget the emotions that moved them. In Nefertari, we find the rare convergence of power and tenderness. And for that reason, perhaps more than any other, she remains. Not as a myth, but as a memory made sacred. And what is memory, if not its own kind of eternity? As modern visitors step into her tomb, they walk not as tourists, but as witnesses. They are quiet, reverent. The air is still. The colors glow. There is no need for explanation. They understand. Without words, they feel the enormity of a woman who lived with purpose, loved with intensity, and passed into legend with grace. And as they leave, many do not speak. They carry her with them. Not in photographs or souvenirs, but in spirit. That is the mark of true legacy. Not in what is held, but in what is felt. Silence is powerful. In the ancient world, silence was not emptiness. It was the space where the sacred resided. Temples were built to echo softly, to let every footstep feel like a whisper to the gods. Tombs were carved into mountains, not to be loud, but to endure. And in the quiet that remains, Nefertari waits. She no longer walks the halls of Pyrameses. She does not sit in court or oversee rituals. But she exists in the stillness between stories. In the way we pause when we see her name. In the hush that follows the word queen. Because some figures in history are remembered for what they did. Others are remembered for what they meant. Nefertari belongs to the latter. She meant loyalty, devotion, reverence, She meant love beyond ceremony, beauty beyond vanity, strength without force, authority without noise. And that, perhaps, is what makes her feel so timeless. You do not need to know the full chronology of the 19th dynasty. You do not need to memorize dates or hieroglyphs or temple names to feel her presence. You only need to see her standing beneath a painted sky, hands raised in prayer, eyes calm, surrounded by stars. That image is enough. It transcends culture, language, belief. She is not just an Egyptian queen. She is an echo of something eternal. We live in a world of speed now. Of notifications, of noise, of urgency. But Nefertari reminds us of a different rhythm. A slower one. One measured in breaths, in incense smoke, in candlelight. She lived in a time when ceremony was not performance, but a bridge between this world and the next. Where each movement meant something. Where even silence had weight. And as we listen to her story now, perhaps we are invited to slow down too. To listen. To feel. To wonder. Because in the end, every great story is not about answers, it's about questions that linger. Who was she, when no one watched? What did she pray for, when no one listened? Did she fear death? Did she dream of being remembered? Or did she simply trust that love, once offered, would carry her through the veil? We'll never know. And perhaps we're not meant to. Some truths are meant to remain unspoken, like the names of gods whispered in the dark. Like the soft footfall of a priestess behind temple columns. Like the heartbeat of a queen as she stood before Osiris, waiting to be judged. But in the quiet that remains, something stirs. It's not her voice. It's not her breath. It's the space she left behind, still warm with meaning. A room within us that remembers something we never saw, but somehow know. And in that space, she lives. Not as a figure of stone, but as a feeling. Not as a name in history, but as a presence in silence. History is not memory. History is what is recorded, catalogued, labeled and boxed. It's the official version, names, dates, wars, treaties. It lives in books and museums. It speaks in footnotes. But memory lives elsewhere. It lives in silence, in feeling, in the space between facts. And for all that history has given us about Nefertari, her titles, her tomb, her royal status, it is memory that gives her life. Because no record tells us the sound of her laughter. No wall carving tells us how she comforted a crying child. No inscription tells us what she whispered to herself in the stillness before dawn. And yet, we can feel her. She exists in the warmth of painted plaster. In the curve of a carved wrist. In the way her eyes meet ours through 3,000 years of dust. This is what separates her from legend. She was real. She breathed. She stood barefoot on stone floors. She ran her fingers across embroidered linen. She tasted pomegranate seeds beneath the palace sun. She watched the horizon rise over the Nile and knew that everything, power, love, even kings, would someday pass. But somehow, she would remain. And maybe that's what she believed. Maybe that's why her tomb was painted so vividly. Not for others. Not for glory. But for herself. So that, in the darkness, she would not forget who she was. Because death, to the Egyptians, was not a descent, it was a crossing. A passage. A journey toward becoming more than mortal. They believed the soul had to remember who it was. To speak its name. To pass through gates guarded by fire and silence. To be judged by a feather. And if the soul remembered enough of itself, it would live. Nefertari's tomb is not merely a place of burial. It is a memory device. A chamber of reminders. Here is who you were. Here are the gods you knew. Here are the truths you held. And here is the light that will carry you through the dark. We see this now, not with the eyes of archaeologists, but with the eyes of fellow humans. We see a woman who loved and was loved, who lived fully and died with dignity, who was mourned not just with tears, but with paint and poetry and stone. And in this morning, a strange kind of joy. Because we know her. Not perfectly. Not completely. But enough to feel her. And what else do we ever really want, in the end? To be felt. To be remembered, not as an icon or ideal, but as someone whose existence left warmth behind. And Nefertari left warmth. In the cracked paint of her tomb, still glowing in soft gold. In the symmetry of her hands in prayer. In the way her name lingers on the lips of those who speak it slowly, gently, across languages and lifetimes. Even in her absence, there is presence. Even in the empty sarcophagus, there is story. And perhaps that is the quiet truth of her immortality. Not that she was the greatest queen. Not that she was the most beautiful. But that in her life, and in her death, she became an anchor for something universal. The desire to be loved. The longing to be remembered. The courage to step into the unknown, adorned not with gold, but with dignity. So when we speak her name now, it is not to recite history. It is to remember a woman who stood 3,000 years ago and said to the gods, I am Nefertari. I have lived. I am still here. What happens when a name survives for 3,000 years? What happens when a woman who lived before iron tools, before Rome, before the rise of even the simplest alphabet, still finds her way into the mouths and minds of people today? Nefertari did not write her own story. But somehow, the world still tells it. In classrooms. In museums. In whispers of tour guides and the reflections of candlelit travelers who step into her tomb, not as tourists, but as guests. And her name, Nefertari, floats softly across continents. Spoken in Arabic and French, in English and Japanese. Translated into films, embroidered on scarves, carved into replicas. She is not forgotten. She has become something more. In many ways, Nefertari today is a bridge. A living link between the ancient and the now. A reminder that the past is not distant. It breathes, if we know how to listen. Visitors to her tomb often describe a kind of hush. A reverence. They walk down stone steps, through a narrow passage, and enter the main chamber. And suddenly, all the noise of modern life falls away. There is only color. Stillness. Awe. The painted images are more than art. They are presence. One wall shows her greeting the gods. Another, offering milk and incense. Another still, standing beneath stars, calm and poised. Even those who know nothing of Egyptian theology can feel the sacredness. You don't need to understand hieroglyphs to sense it. That this was a person. That this was a woman of great inner light. That someone, a people, a husband, a civilization, loved her enough to preserve her in radiant detail. That, in itself, is a message across time. In a world where so many are forgotten, she was not. And maybe that's what draws people in. Not the gold. Not the mystery. But the love. You can feel it in the inscriptions from Ramses. You can feel it in the care taken by artisans who painted the tomb, stroke by stroke, as if building a world for her to walk into. And it continues today. Artists recreate her face in charcoal and oil. Filmmakers use her story to explore themes of power and femininity. Historians write essays. Children write school reports. Even in corners of the internet, digital communities preserve her name with memes, stories, reels, ancient history finding new life in glowing screens. It's not always accurate, but it is alive. And in that life, Nefertari finds a second kind of immortality. She becomes not just a figure of Egypt, but of the human story itself. A woman remembered not for conquest, but for calm. Not for cruelty, but for beauty and strength of spirit. Not for victory, but for balance. And balance, in today's world, is sacred. She reminds us that a woman can be strong in quiet ways. That dignity can be as lasting as steel. That a story does not need to be loud to echo forever. Even her absence carries meaning. We do not know the sound of her voice. We do not know the exact curve of her smile, the rhythm of her walk, the texture of her thoughts. But we know enough to be moved. And that movement, that still stirring of something deep inside us, is what keeps her alive. It is said that a person truly dies when their name is spoken for the last time. By that measure, Nefertari is very much alive. She lives in the breath of schoolchildren trying to pronounce her name. She lives in the hush of visitors staring up at painted stars. She lives in the fingertips of conservators restoring a fading figure. She lives in the heartbeats of lovers who wonder if anyone will remember them the way Ramses remembered her. And she lives in you, listening now, as her story passes through your ears, as your breath slows, as you find comfort in the idea that something beautiful can last. Even across deserts. Even across dynasties. Even across death. There is something sacred about the final moment of a story. It doesn't always arrive with noise or fanfare. Sometimes, it simply comes as a breath. A quiet understanding that nothing more needs to be said. That silence is now enough. And here we are, at the edge of Nefertari's long journey. Together. Not at the beginning of a new chapter, but at the part where we let her go. Not as a figure of study. Not as a statue in a temple, but as something more intimate, more human. A woman who lived. A woman who was loved. As we lie here in the quiet, perhaps on a bed, perhaps in a chair, or maybe simply in our thoughts, let us return once more to that valley. The Valley of the Queens. Where the air is still. And the stones remember. The tomb is silent now. Not because it is empty, but because it is full of presence. The colors still cling to the walls. The figures still walk across the plaster. And in the ceiling above, stars remain, untouched by time, still watching. There, in that underground room, Nefertari sleeps. She does not call out. She does not ask to be remembered. And yet, we do. We remember. We remember not because we were told to, but because something in her story stayed with us. Something soft. Something tender. Something that reminds us of ourselves. Her image in prayer. Her hands raised gently. Her gaze eternal. They become mirrors. And in those mirrors, we see what we hope for. Peace. Grace. A gentle goodbye. Let go of her now. Not in forgetfulness, but in trust. That she has found her place beyond the veil. And that you, listening now, are not so far behind. Because all stories end. And all souls drift. But the ones we carry, they never leave us. Tonight, let Nefertari rest. Let her lie beneath stars painted by hands long gone. Let her walk the fields of reeds, where no fear follows, and no sorrow lingers. Let the fire beside you crackle. Let your breath slow. Let your eyes grow heavy. And let this memory stay. Not as history, but as peace. She was the queen for whom the sun shone. And tonight, she is the star that watches over your sleep. Some stories are not meant to end, only to rest. And in that rest, we find a reflection of ourselves. The silence she leaves behind is not empty, it's full of meaning. Every pause is a breath she once took, echoing through time. Every shadow in her tomb holds the warmth of her memory. When we close our eyes, we walk beside her once more. Through golden corridors of memory, past the soft touch of linen curtains. She speaks in stillness, not with words, but with presence. And in that presence, we are made whole. We are not just remembering her. We are remembering something in us that she awakens. A longing for peace. A longing for grace. A longing for someone to have walked before us with dignity and calm. She was not perfect, and that makes her eternal. Because she was real, strong and vulnerable, sacred and human. We light a candle in our hearts now, not for mourning, but for honoring. Let that flame stay with you tonight. Let it guide you into sleep, into dreams where she stands among the stars. Silent, smiling, still. A queen who no longer needs to rule. Only to be remembered, as she was, in light. She does not need temples now. She lives in the quiet. In the hush before sleep. In the breath between thoughts. She walks not in gold, but in memory. And memory does not fade. So rest now. Let go of today. Let her take your hand. And guide you not into the past, but into peace. She is still here. Not in stone, but in stillness.